Okay, hello everyone. Today we are going to be diverging a little bit from what we've done in the past, and we're going to start looking at our third market structure. So remember, there are a total of four of them. We've looked at two of them so far, the first being perfect competition and the second one being monopoly, and those are very different. If you recall, we kind of had that spectrum of competition, and on the far right, for what was most competitive, we had perfect competition, and all the way on the left, we had what was least competitive. And then that's where monopoly was. With oligopoly, we're going to fall somewhere in between that range. Okay, so an oligopoly is characterized by a few firms. And they're going to function together in a manner that is similar to a monopoly. So they will have some market power. So they'll be able to adjust prices and such, just like a monopoly can. If you want, think in terms of Pepsi and Coca-Cola, right? Two firms that own most of the soda industry in our country. You can think of oil industries or car companies where there's just a few firms that are going to dominate the market. The reality is that if they do work together, they will function similar to a monopoly. Fortunately, for those of us that are consumers, they can't have that same market power, which, if you recall from a monopoly, is inefficient, right? It causes deadweight loss. That's not a good thing. So thankfully, one thing stands in their way, and that's what we call game theory. No graphs for oligopoly. Yay! Instead, we have something called the theory matrix. It's rather simple, and I think you will find it an easy concept to grasp. So, when we were talking about that spectrum, what lies between monopoly and perfect competition? Well, you have perfectly competitive and then no competition, so it just stands to reason that in between is what we call imperfect competition. So these are market structures that are going to have industries that do face some competition. So they do face some competition. Oligopolies even face competition. I think we can all fully understand that Pepsi and Coca-Cola very clearly face competition with one another. However, I think we can also agree that they don't face nearly the same amount as something in a perfectly competitive market, right? Coca-Cola only has to worry about what Pepsi is doing. They don't have to try to figure out what 1,000 different soda companies are doing. So they are facing competition, but not nearly as much as perfectly competitive. So therefore, they are not price takers. So what lies between those two? Well, the one that we'll be talking about today is oligopoly. And this is, as I said earlier, a few sellers. And they're going to offer similar or identical products to each other. It does not matter if they are similar or identical, which is important because that was a differentiation that we had earlier when it came to perfect competition, right? We said that for perfectly competitive markets, it had to be similar products. It doesn't matter, right? You could have oil, which is identical products, or it could be something like cars, which are a little bit different, right? But very similar. The other one we'll look at on another video is monopolistic competition, and these are where firms sell products that are similar but not identical. Okay, as we've done in the past, I just want to take a second because it's a helpful reminder, it's worth jotting in your notes of how do we split up the four market structures. And you have to begin by asking the question, how many firms are there? The number of firms. If there's only one firm that supplies a good or service, produces a good or service, think to yourself for a moment, if there's only one, what is it going to be? Well, the answer clearly is that it's going to be a monopoly, right? So you've got your tap water, your utilities, right? Your natural monopolies. Cable TV could be an example. If there's just a few firms, that's what we're looking at today. We're looking at oligopolies. So things like Pepsi, things like tennis ball companies, things like crude oil. There's just a few companies that are going to dominate. However, if there's a lot of different firms, you have to split it even further, and that's something that we'll get to later, but it's the type of product. If it's a differentiated product, in other words, there are many, many firms that make slightly different things, we're going to call those monopolistically competitive market structures. Movies, books, and that such. And then the one that we looked at to start all this was perfectly competitive, which is going to be identical products, usually very broad, things like wheat and milk. Okay, markets with only a few sellers. Because an oligopoly only has a few sellers, the tension between cooperation and their self-interest is going to be what defines the price. Let me say that one more time. The difference between the tension and the cooperation and self-interest is going to be what defines the price. So it stands to reason that the more people there are competing, the more competitive it's going to be, and therefore the price will be down. We'll see that in a moment. But that tension is key, okay? And when we're talking about oligopolies, for the record, sometimes we talk about small numbers, which is like 2 or 3 oligopolies, and it can go all the way up to maybe 8 firms or so. But all of them have the same characteristics, and there's 3 of them, and it's very important that you remember these. Number 1 characteristic is that there are few sellers, okay? There are few sellers. Number 2, they are interdependent. They're not independent from one another. They are dependent on the other person's actions. In fact, the other firm's actions dictate what they do. We'll see that in a moment. And then lastly, they would be best off if they cooperate. If these firms, these small firms in a market can cooperate, then they can essentially flex your economic muscle, kind of like that market power we saw with monopolies. So as I said earlier, you have up to maybe 8, maybe 10 firms in existence. You could call that an oligopoly. In our case, in our situation, almost always you're going to see them in terms of 2, which is what we call a duopoly. Okay, so this is an oligopoly with only 2 members. It's the most simple and pure form of an oligopoly. That's the one we'll spend most of our time on. Now, you don't have to write this next bit down, of course, but let me just tell you a little bit of a story. This won't surprise any of you probably, but when I was in elementary school, my older brother and I were quite the little 6-year-old hustlers when it came to going to school. On the way to our elementary school, there was a Super America, and what my brother started doing, and I kind of joined in with him, is he would buy a box of donuts from SA on the way to elementary school. And then when we got to school, he would sell them to the teachers and to the students. It's actually not a bad idea. So let me ask you this. Here's the scenario I want you to consider. If my brother charges $1 for a donut, which is what he sold them for, and I wanted to join the market, what should a little 5-year-old Mr. Held, what should I charge for the market? Or excuse me, charge for my donuts? Okay, think about that. If he charges it for $1, what should I charge it for? Well, of course, if you're like me, you're sitting there thinking, well, I bet if I undercut him in price, people will want to buy from me instead of him. And you're absolutely right. That's what I did. So I charged 75 cents, and I was successful. A lot of the other students would come and buy my donuts instead of my brother's. Yahoo! However, my question to you is this. What did my brother do? Well, it's probably not too hard to guess. My brother, of course, got very frustrated, and aside from maybe punching me in the face once or twice, he charged 50 cents for his donuts. Okay, he charged 50 cents for his donuts. All of a sudden, I want you to consider, am I better off than if I charged $1? Because what do I need to do now? I need to undercut him once more. And you see where I'm getting at here. Even though there were only 2 of us selling donuts, there wasn't 100 kids selling donuts. There was only 2 of us. But our competition with one another caused tension in our market power. Would we have been better off if we were able to agree and both sell for $1? I'm going to give you a short example here in a moment, and the point of this is mostly to show you why we don't really graph oligopolies. So I'm going to give you this schedule, and we will use it in the next few slides to kind of talk about how a monopoly would function, how a perfectly competitive firm would function in this given situation. So I'll be referring to it a couple times. You're welcome to go back and look at it again. Just know that the point of it is mostly for you to understand why it's difficult to graph an oligopoly. So just to start out with this, on the left-hand column, you can see that we have quantity of gallons. So we'll say this is for water. And you can see the price there in the middle column. Notice that this is not perfectly elastic price as would be perfectly competitive, right? It goes down, it de-escalates, okay? It's at 0 quantity, it's 120. At 10 quantity, it's $110. So we have a downward sloping price or demand curve. And then you can see the total revenue over there on the right. One thing I want to point out before I continue is notice at 60 gallons. Look at 60 gallons there. What is the price at 60 gallons? Well, it's actually 60. And if you look over at total revenue, you'll see that that's $3,600. That is going to be the max total revenue. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. Again, I will be referring to this as we go forward. But at 60 gallons, that is when my total revenue is maximized. So let's do a quick example. If the price of the water, based on that information that we just looked at previously on the previous slide, if this was in a perfectly competitive market, the marginal cost would be driven to 0. That's something that we've looked at in the past, right? This is where profit, MC equals MR, right? Price equals marginal cost. So MC equals MR, where profit is 0. And so if we use that information, the quantity that would be produced of water would be 120 gallons. Right, so that's important, 120 gallons for $0. If we were to go on the other end of the spectrum, and if we were to function as a monopoly would function, then we would produce where total profit is maximized. In that case, as you recall, that was a quantity of 60 gallons. And if I'm selling for $60, then of course my total revenue would be $3,600. So just look at those two side by side quick. You can see that the perfect competition, I have high quantity for a low price of 0. And then if it was a monopoly, I would have a lower quantity for a much higher price, right? They've exercised their market power. The perfectly competitive solution, or the socially efficient solution, where price equals marginal cost, or in our scenario where MC equals MR, the quantity of water was 120, but monopolists would produce 60 gallons of water. So my question to you, for you to consider, is this: what outcome would be expected from a duopolist? 120 gallons made in perfect competition, 60 gallons in a monopoly. Where would a duopolist fall? I have here a graph, and again, this is to show you why it's difficult to graph oligopolies. If we just do this quickly, our marginal cost is going to be constant at $0, all right? And remember, we do not have a perfectly elastic demand curve. Rather, we have a downward sloping one. Because if you remember, at 0 quantity of water, the cost was $120. But at 120 quantity, the cost is 0. And so for perfectly competitive, for perfect competition, remember, MC equals MR, and so it's going to be 0. Now, a monopolist would be able to produce 60 gallons, and they would be able to upcharge, right? They don't have to charge $0 because they're the only ones supplying water in the entire economy. And so you can see that price would actually be higher than marginal cost. So here's what I'm getting at. In a perfectly competitive market, all the way there on the bottom right of the graph, 120 gallons will be produced for $0. Further on the left, in a monopoly, 60 gallons will be produced for a high cost of 60. The reality is that in a duopoly, it's going to fall somewhere in between. And therein lies the problem. We don't know very well or accurately where it falls. That's a big range, isn't it? Between 60 and 120. All we know is that it will be more competitive than Monopoly, but less competitive than Perfect Competition. So it's going to be somewhere in there. Okay. Duopolists may agree. Okay, think about my brother and me for an example when it came to the donuts, right? Sometimes duopolists agree to work together. We call this, the economic term for it is collusion. So this is an agreement between firms in a market about a quantity that is going to be produced and prices that get charged. So my brother and I could keep our prices at $1. Or, and yes, we tried this once, we could both agree to raise it. Hey, it's only the two of us selling donuts. Let's both of us sell it for $2 a piece. And we'll do better off than if we were competing. So if you work together, we call that collusion. In other words, my brother and I, at the ripe ages of 5 years old and 7 years old, formed a cartel, which is basically the economic term for a group of firms acting in unison. If you've ever been curious, maybe you've heard that term before. Famously, there are the drug cartels, and you may have not known this, but cartel is the economic term for being collusion of oligopolies. So the drug cartels of South America are really massive firms that have illegal products, but they are working together as far as keeping prices high. Illegal drugs actually should be a much lower price, but because of collusion, they are working together in tandem. So that's what cartel means. Although oligopolists would love to form cartels, because remember, if you can work together, you earn higher profits. In other words, you can work more like a monopoly. Sometimes that's not possible. First thing I want you to remember, and try to remember this one, there are antitrust laws which make explicit agreements illegal. In other words, Pepsi can't call or email Coca-Cola and say, hey, let's both do this, right? Gas stations can't have a cartel where they all say, let's all raise the price of a gas of gasoline up to $5 a gallon. They can't do that, right? We have laws that protect us from that. So basically, my brother and I, with our donuts, if we get caught, which is tough to prove, we'll go to jail. Well, in theory, at least. We'd be 5 and 7 years old, so we'd probably actually just get like a fine or get in trouble at school. But you understand what I'm saying here. Okay? Antitrust laws prohibit explicit agreements. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why gas stations are always near each other, because they are prohibited from actually having collusion, but it is not against the law to sit across the street and watch the other person change their prices per gallon and adjust yours to meet theirs. Now, many firms will engage in what's called tacit collusion, which is when you work together without actually talking about it. It's kind of that unwritten, unknown, you kind of give each other the look, right? And you know, hey, I'm going to charge high if you charge high, and it's just this unwritten thing. It means there's no evidence, and so nobody can actually get into trouble. That's tacit collusion. Now, as we start to wrap this up for today, I want to talk about what we call the Nash equilibrium. And this became famous by a gentleman by the name of John Nash, who actually just passed away a couple years ago. Famous for being the character in A Beautiful Mind, if you've ever seen that Russell Crowe movie. And John Nash came up with this suggestion that economic actors who interact with one another, so firms that are competing with one another, will choose their best strategy given the strategies that all the others have chosen. given the strategies that all the others have chosen. So I will base my actions based on what other people have done. Okay? What other people are going to do. A firm is considered in their Nash equilibrium when, if they change their behavior, they cannot do better. In other words, they will not change their behavior. If I change my action and I don't improve, if I don't gain more revenue or more utility, I won't change my behavior. If that is the case, then a firm is experiencing their Nash equilibrium. This will become more clear as we start looking at the payoff matrices in the second video. One thing just to make a note of, and this was something that's become a little tricky and I've seen on the AP test more and more recently, is that there can be more than one Nash in a given problem. More than one Nash equilibrium. Actually, it's possible that there are no Nashes in a market. That's a real possibility. So we'll look at that a little bit later, but just be aware of that. Okay, so when firms in an oligopoly choose to maximize their profit, going all the way back to when we were looking at the gallons of water, they'll produce a quantity that is greater, so a higher level than a monopoly would, but it's going to be less than producing in competition or a perfectly competitive market. The oligopoly price is less than the monopoly, but greater than a competitive price. So what is the probability? What is the most likely outcome when it comes to comes to an oligopoly? Well, it's that they're going to pursue their own self-interest. In other words, there will be no collusion. Joint output is greater than monopoly, but less than competitive industries. Market prices will be lower than a monopoly, but greater than a competitive firm. And so ultimately, total profits are less than a monopoly profit. I hope you're kind of understanding what I'm getting at here. They function similar to a monopoly, but don't get it wrong. They are not a monopoly. In fact, their competition with each other will drive their prices down from what a monopoly could charge, but still have higher than what a competitive market could have. So, how does the size of the oligopoly affect the market outcome? We talked about a duopoly, right? Only 2 people. What if there was 8 people? Okay. How does the increase in the number of sellers affect the price and quantity? Well, I think you can probably brainstorm this in your head already. Think for a moment before I move on. If I added more people selling donuts to my elementary school, what would happen to the price of donuts and the quantity as we added more people? Think about that. Well, 2 things are at place, and we've seen these before. The output effect, right? Because the price is above marginal cost, selling more is going to raise profits. However, at the same time, we have the price effect. Raising production will actually lower the price, right? We had a downward sloping demand curve. So higher quantity, as we move right on the graph, higher quantity leads to lower price on the y-axis, okay, per unit. So both of those are going to be at play at the same time, just like we've seen in the past. As the number of sellers in an oligopoly grows larger, the oligopolistic market looks more and more competitive. Okay, as we went from 2 to 4, from 4 to 10, as we get up to 20 people selling donuts, if we get all the way up to 200 students selling donuts, could I really change the price of my donut very well? No, I couldn't. The price approaches marginal cost. The quantity produced approaches that socially efficient level that we talked about.